I am sitting by the window when the memory begins, the late afternoon light turning the dust into floating gold. My hands are old now, veined and thin, but they remember everything. When people call me Grandma Matilda, they see the gray hair and the slow steps. They don't see the girl I was when I learned how silence can bruise you or how respect can heal you in places love never touched. I was 19 the winter my father sold me. He didn't say it like that, of course. He said he was making arrangements, the way men do when they want their conscience to sleep at night. We lived in a narrow house in Ohio where the walls knew all our arguments and the floors creaked with secrets. My mother had been dead 3 years by then, and my father's grief had hardened into something sharp and practical. Bills piled up. The factory cut hours. My younger brothers needed boots, and I, the eldest daughter, had become a solution. I remember the day he told me. Snow pressed against the windows like a held breath. He didn't look at me when he said the man's name, Walter Green, and he didn't say the age difference out loud, though it hovered between us like a bad smell. He said Walter was stable. He said Walter owned land. He said Walter had lost his wife and needed companionship. He said it would be good for everyone. I nodded because I had learned how to nod. That night, alone in my room, I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and tried to imagine the rest of my life. I imagined a house that wasn't mine, a bed where my body would feel borrowed. I imagined my name losing its meaning. Fear is strange like that. It doesn't scream at first. It whispers patiently until you start whispering back. The wedding was small and quiet. I wore a dress that had belonged to a cousin, altered at the waist. Walter stood beside me, taller than I expected, his hair already thinning, his mouth set in a line that looked more tired than cruel. When he took my hand, his palm was warm and steady. That unsettled me more than roughness would have. I had prepared myself for a jailer, not a man who smelled faintly of soap in winter. Afterward, he drove me away from the only streets I had known, past fields stiff with frost. I watched the land stretch and flatten, mile after mile, until my old life felt like a rumor. The house he brought me to was set back from the road, plain and sturdy, with a porch that sagged just a little. It looked like a place where time moved slowly, whether you wanted it to or not. Inside, he showed me the rooms like a host, not a husband. The kitchen, the bedroom, the small spare room that had once belonged to his daughter, he said, his voice catching just enough to let me know it was a wound he lived with. She had died years earlier, a fever that took her fast. His wife followed not long after, though he didn't say how. Some griefs don't need details. That first night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. I waited for footsteps, for the weight of expectation. Instead, there was only the tick of the clock and the sound of his breathing from the other side of the door. At dawn, when I finally slept, I dreamed of doors that opened when I touched them. Days passed. Weeks. Walter spoke little, but when he did, it was careful. He asked what foods I liked. He asked if I preferred coffee or tea. He never raised his voice. And always there was that distance between us, measured and intentional. I didn't know what to do with that. I had been taught to brace myself, to endure. There was nothing to endure, and that confused me more than cruelty would have. One afternoon, as I scrubbed the sink, I cut my finger on a chipped plate. Blood welled bright and sudden. I stood there staring at it, a ridiculous thing to cry over. Walter appeared beside me without a word, took my hand gently and wrapped it in a clean cloth. His fingers trembled just slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, though he hadn't done anything. That was the first crack in the wall I had built inside myself. The secret came out on a Sunday evening after supper, when the sky had gone purple and the cicadas had started their chorus. We sat across from each other at the table, the space between us heavy with things unsaid. He cleared his throat, folded his hands, and finally looked at me straight on. "There's something you should know," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. I waited. I had been waiting my whole life. He told me then about the accident at the mill years earlier, how a beam had crushed his back, how the doctors had done what they could. He told me about the pain that never left, about the nights he slept sitting up because lying down hurt too much. He told me about the way his body no longer obeyed him the way it once had, about the parts of marriage he could no longer offer. "I didn't want to trap you," he said, and there it was, raw and honest. "But I needed someone, and your father needed money. I told myself it was fair." I felt something inside me loosen, something I hadn't known was clenched. The prison I had imagined dissolved into a different kind of reality, one shaped by limits, by truths spoken instead of demands made. "I'm not trapped," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "I just didn't know where I was standing." He nodded, relief and sadness tangled together. From that night on, our marriage took on a shape that belonged to us alone. We were companions before we were anything else. He taught me how to tend the land, how to listen to weather in my bones. I taught him how to cook my mother's recipes, how to laugh at small things. We shared a bed for warmth and habit, not for passion, and in that space I found something like peace. People talked, of course. In town, eyes followed us, curiosity sharpened by disapproval. I learned how to meet those looks without flinching. I learned that dignity can be quiet, that strength doesn't always announce itself. I grew into myself there, in that house set back from the road, in a life no one had imagined for me. Years later, when Walter's health worsened, I became his hands and his feet. I read to him in the evenings, my voice filling the spaces his body could no longer reach. When he died, it was winter again, the snow pressing against the windows like a held breath. I held his hand as it went still, and I did not feel abandoned. I felt changed. I stayed in that house. I raised children there. Yes, children, because life has a way of surprising you when you stop trying to script it. Love came to me later in a different form, with a man who understood the life I had lived and honored it. Together, we built something steady and warm, a family that grew like a slow, stubborn plant. Now, as I sit by the window, I hear my grandchildren in the other room, their laughter bright and careless. They know me as the woman who tells stories softly, who bakes bread on Sundays, who listens more than she speaks. They don't know the girl who learned how fear can turn into freedom, or how an unconventional love can teach you the deepest respect. But maybe they will someday. Maybe they'll hear it in my voice when I tell them that there are many ways to survive and many ways to love. And maybe they'll understand that sometimes the life you are given is not the life that breaks you, but the one that shows you who you are. I learned slowly that a life can be built out of listening. After Walter died, the house felt both too big and too small. His chair remained angled toward the window, the cushion shaped by years of his careful sitting. For weeks, I caught myself turning to tell him things, the way the frost came early that year, the strange red bird I saw near the fence, before remembering that the space beside me was no longer occupied. Grief didn't arrive like a wave. It seeped in, quiet and persistent, settling into corners. I was 26 when I buried my first husband, though I still hesitated to use that word. Husband. It carried expectations we had never fulfilled, and yet it was the truest word available. He had been my partner in survival, my teacher in restraint, my proof that respect could exist without desire. Standing by his grave, the winter air slicing my lungs, I understood something that startled me with its clarity. I had not been wasted. My youth had not been stolen, it had been shaped. I stayed on the land because leaving felt like erasing him, and erasing myself along with him. The neighbors assumed I would sell, move back to town, start over somewhere more suitable for a young widow. I smiled, thanked them for their concern, and stayed. Every morning I pulled on my boots and walked the perimeter of the fields, feeling the ground answer my steps. The work kept me honest. The solitude taught me how to hear my own thoughts without fear. It was during that second spring alone that I began to write. At first, it was nothing more than notes scribbled in the margins of old ledgers, observations about weather, about the way grief changed color depending on the light. Then the notes grew into sentences, and the sentences into pages. I wrote in the evenings, the lamp casting a small, defiant circle against the dark. I wrote about my mother, about my father's silence, about the marriage that had not been what anyone expected. I wrote because it felt like breathing. One afternoon, while buying seed in town, I ran into Clara Evans, the librarian. She noticed the notebook tucked under my arm and asked about it. Something in her voice, curious but not prying, made me answer honestly. She asked if I'd ever thought about sharing my writing. I laughed, a sharp sound that surprised us both. Sharing felt dangerous. Words, once released, could not be taken back. Still, a week later, I found myself sitting in the library's small back room, my hands shaking as I read aloud to a circle of women. They were different ages, different lives, bound together by that quiet hunger to be seen. When I finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then one woman reached out and touched my arm, her eyes wet. "Thank you," she said, as if I had given her something tangible. That was the beginning of another life, one I hadn't known to imagine. I continued to farm, continued to live simply, but once a week I went into town to read, to listen, to bear witness. Stories came to me like birds landing on an open hand. Women spoke of marriages that had shrunk them, of choices made under pressure, of losses that never found language. I didn't offer solutions. I offered attention. I had learned how powerful that could be. It was at one of those gatherings that I met Samuel Reed. He arrived late, standing awkwardly near the door as if unsure he was allowed to be there. When our eyes met, he nodded, a small, respectful gesture. Afterward, as the room emptied, he approached me with the same careful distance Walter once had. He told me his sister had died the previous year, that he had come because he didn't know what to do with his grief anymore. We talked for an hour that first night, then for many nights after. Samuel was a carpenter, his hands broad and scarred, his voice gentle. He asked questions and waited for answers. He never tried to hurry me. Friendship unfolded between us, steady and unforced. When months later he reached for my hand, it felt like a door opening, not abruptly, but with a familiar, welcoming creak. Loving Samuel was different. There was warmth and desire, yes, but also an undercurrent of mutual recognition. He knew I had lived a life before him, one that mattered. He never asked me to diminish it. When we married, it was with laughter and sunlight, a gathering of people who had chosen us rather than arranged us. I was 30 by then, and for the first time, my age felt like an asset. We had children, 2 sons, a daughter. Pregnancy frightened me at first, the way new chapters often do when you've learned not to assume safety. But my body remembered how to adapt. I carried each child with a mix of awe and terror, feeling the past and future collide inside me. Motherhood did not erase my earlier self. It layered over her, adding depth and urgency. Our house filled with noise, toys scattered across the floor, shoes by the door. The field still demanded attention, but now there were small hands reaching for mine as I walked. At night, after the children slept, Samuel and I sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing the weight of the day. I told him stories about Walter, about the strange, quiet marriage that had shaped me. He listened without jealousy, without judgment. "You were loved," he said once simply. And he was right. Time, as it does, kept moving. Children grew, the writing group expanded, became a fixture in town. My notebooks multiplied, then transformed into published essays that traveled farther than I ever had. Letters arrived from women across the country, telling me my words had given them permission to name their own lives. Each letter felt like a responsibility, and I held it carefully. When my father fell ill, I returned to the narrow house of my childhood. He was smaller than I remembered, his certainty eroded by age. We spoke of many things and avoided others. Near the end, he took my hand with surprising strength. "I thought I was doing right by you," he said, his voice thin. "I know," I answered. It was the truth, or close enough to it. Forgiveness is not a single act, it's a practice. Now, years later, I watch my grandchildren play and think about the threads that bind us. They know the world is a place of possibility, and I am glad for that. But I also know the value of the stories we don't tell loudly, the ones that live in pauses and glances and choices made under constraint. I speak to them gently about resilience, about listening to themselves even when others speak louder. I don't romanticize suffering. I don't pretend endurance is easy. I tell them that love can be quiet and still be real, that respect is not a consolation prize. At night, when the house is still, I sometimes open my old notebooks. The early pages are uneven, the ink faded. I read the words of a young woman who believed she was walking into a prison and discovered, instead, a complicated freedom. I want to reach back through time and touch her shoulder, tell her she will survive more than she thinks. The window beside me reflects my face now, lined, softened, unmistakably alive. I am not just a memory, though memory lives in me. I am not just a grandmother, though that title fills me with pride. I am a woman who learned that imperfection does not disqualify us from love, that unconventional paths can lead to solid ground. And there is more to tell. There is always more. There was a year, my 42nd, that tested everything I believed about steadiness. It began quietly, the way most upheavals do. Samuel started coming home later, his shoulders tight, his smiles delayed. The mill where he took most of his commissions was downsizing, and rumors moved faster than facts. I watched him from the doorway some evenings, the children already asleep, and felt a familiar pressure gather in my chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. I had seen this shape before, the way uncertainty crouches, waiting to be acknowledged. One night after the last dish was dried and put away, he sat across from me at the table and said, "I might lose the shop." The words hung there, plain and heavy. I didn't rush to fill the space. Silence had taught me too much to disrespect it. "We'll figure it out," I said, finally, and I meant it not as a promise of ease but as a statement of fact. We had figured out worse. Weeks passed. The mill closed 2 of its wings. Samuel's hours shrank, then vanished. He tried to hide the worst of his worry, but marriage has a way of making secrecy inefficient. Money grew tight. I took on more readings, more writing commissions. I said yes to invitations that scared me, auditoriums, conferences, interviews, because fear had long ago stopped being a reliable guide. The children noticed, of course. Children always do. Our eldest son asked if we were moving. Our daughter started sleeping with the light on again. I gathered them one evening and told them the truth in careful pieces. I told them families bend. I told them we were still us, that winter was hard. Not dramatic hard, but grinding hard. The kind that wears at you in small, daily ways. Samuel's pride bruised easily. My patience thinned. We argued quietly but often about things that stood in for larger worries. Groceries, gas, whether the roof could wait another year. Once in the middle of it, I felt a flash of something sharp and old, the urge to shrink, to brace. Instead, I spoke. "I won't disappear to make this easier," I told him, my voice steady despite the tremor underneath. "I did that once, I won't do it again." He looked at me then, really looked, and something shifted. He nodded, his eyes wet. "I don't want you to," he said. "I just forgot how to ask for help." That was another lesson, delivered late but welcome. That strength can make you lonely if you don't let it be seen. Spring brought small mercies. Samuel picked up independent work, one cabinet at a time. I sold a longer piece to a national magazine, the check arriving on a Tuesday like an answered prayer. We patched the roof ourselves, laughing at our own incompetence. The children adjusted, as children do, their resilience both humbling and reassuring. That summer, my writing group held its 10th anniversary. Women traveled from out of state to attend. We filled the community hall with folding chairs and shared air thick with anticipation. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and felt the familiar hush settle. I told them a story I had never told publicly before. I spoke of the first winter with Walter, of the night he told me the truth about his body, about the relief that followed honesty. I spoke of how that marriage, so misjudged by others, had taught me the architecture of respect. I didn't romanticize it, I honored it. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her hands twisting in the hem of her dress. I thought my life was over, she said, her voice breaking. But maybe it's just different. Different isn't the enemy, I told her. Silence is. As the years layered themselves one over another, I watched my children become themselves. Our eldest left for college, his absence a physical ache in the house. Our daughter found her voice in music, filling rooms the way I once filled pages. Our youngest lingered longest, absorbing stories like nourishment. I learned how to let go without unraveling, how to trust that what I had given them would travel with them. Samuel's hair grayed. My hands stiffened in the mornings. The farm changed hands slowly, piece by piece, until we kept only what we could manage without strain. We moved closer to town, trading fields for neighbors, solitude for proximity. I missed the land, but not enough to regret the move. Seasons change, so do needs. Now, when people introduce me before I speak, they list things: author, advocate, grandmother. I smile and take my place, aware of the distance between labels and lived truth. When I speak, I don't raise my voice. I don't need to. Years have taught me that resonance comes from alignment, not volume. I tell them that endurance is not the same as silence. That respect is not a consolation, but a foundation. That love, in all its forms, asks us to stay awake. Sometimes, after these talks, I return home and sit by the window again, the same posture, a different life. Samuel brings me tea. The house hums softly around us. I think of the girl I was, nodding because she didn't know how to do anything else. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her this: the story does not end where you think it will. It widens, it deepens, it waits for you to claim it. And I am still here, claiming it one quiet breath at a time. There came a moment when I understood that legacy is not something you leave behind. It's something you live inside of, every day, whether you mean to or not. I was 68 when my first grandchild was born. A girl. They placed her in my arms, small and red and furious at the world, and I felt time fold in on itself. My hands, once steady from years of farm work, trembled, not from weakness, from recognition. I looked at her face and saw every woman who had ever stood where I stood, afraid, resilient, unnamed. They asked me what to call her. I said her name aloud and felt it settle into the room like a promise. As the grandchildren multiplied, the house filled again with the sounds of beginnings. Different sounds this time, lighter, less desperate. I watched my children parent in ways I never had the chance to, gentler and more deliberate. I bit my tongue when I wanted to intervene. Wisdom, I had learned, is knowing when to speak and when to trust what you've already planted. Still, the past never stayed entirely quiet. One autumn afternoon, I received a letter postmarked from a town I hadn't heard mentioned in decades. The handwriting was careful, unfamiliar. Inside was a single page and a photograph. The photograph showed a young man standing beside a woman I recognized instantly, my mother, before the years took her softness. The letter was from a cousin I barely remembered, cleaning out an old house. "I thought you should have this," she wrote. "There are things here that belong to your mother. She spoke of you often." I sat with that letter for a long time. Grief doesn't end, it just changes its posture. That night I told Samuel about it, about the ache that still surprised me with its sharpness. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "Yes," I said after a moment. "I think I do." We traveled together, a small overnight bag and a lifetime between us. The house was nearly empty when we arrived, its rooms echoing with other people's ghosts. I walked through slowly, my fingers grazing door frames, shelves, the edge of a mirror. In a box tucked beneath the stairs, I found my mother's journal. Her handwriting slanted and looping, her thoughts preserved like pressed flowers. I read it that night in the guest room, Samuel asleep beside me. She wrote about worry, about hope, about me. One line stopped me cold: I want her to have a life that feels like her own. I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I had honored her, not by escaping pain, but by refusing to let it be the only language I spoke. Age brings a narrowing of the body and an expansion of perspective. My knees complain. My hearing falters in crowded rooms, but my sense of what matters has sharpened. I no longer chase approval. I offer presence. I no longer fear being misunderstood. I fear only being silent when a voice is needed. There are nights now when sleep comes lightly. I lie awake listening to the house breathe, the same way I once listened to a different house, a different life. I think about Walter, about the quiet courage it took him to tell the truth. I think about Samuel asleep beside me, his hand finding mine even in dreams. I think about the women who still write to me, asking if it's too late. It never is. The last talk I gave before stepping back from the road was at a small college auditorium. I stood at the podium, the lights warm on my face, and spoke without notes. I told them that freedom doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like staying. Sometimes it looks like redefining the terms you were handed. Sometimes it looks like surviving long enough to tell the story yourself. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then applause, not loud but deep. I stepped down feeling lighter, as if something had finally settled into place. Now, when my grandchildren ask me to tell them a story, I choose carefully. I don't soften the truth, but I shape it with care. I tell them that people are complicated, that love is not a single shape, that their worth is not negotiable. I watch their faces as they listen, their futures still unwritten, and I feel a fierce, tender hope. I am not extraordinary, I am not a symbol. I am a woman who lived a life that refused to be simple and in doing so became whole. And there is still one more truth waiting to be spoken. The truth arrived quietly, the way the most important ones often do. Came to me on an ordinary morning, the kind that no one would mark on a calendar. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the worn wood, my granddaughter Lily coloring beside me. She was 7 then, serious about her crayons, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She looked up suddenly and asked, "Grandma, were you ever scared when you were my age?" The question caught me off guard, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was vast. "Yes," I said. "Very? Of what?" I looked at her small face, open and unafraid, and felt the weight of choosing my words. "Of being unheard," I told her. "Of not getting to decide who I would be." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense, and went back to her coloring. Children accept truths adults argue with. After she left that afternoon, I stayed at the table, my tea cooling untouched. I realized then that the story I had been telling for years, the one about resilience, about unconventional love, about survival, had always been framed around endurance. What I hadn't said enough, not even to myself, was this: I had also chosen joy. Again and again, quietly, against expectation. That mattered. In the weeks that followed, I felt a restlessness I hadn't known in years. Not dissatisfaction, but a gentle insistence. There was one more piece of my life I hadn't fully claimed, not because it was shameful, but because it was tender. I had never spoken publicly about the moment I realized I was free. It wasn't when Walter died. It wasn't when I married Samuel. It wasn't even when my writing found an audience. It was earlier than all of that, hidden in plain sight. I was 22, still newly married to Walter, still learning the rhythms of that quiet house. One afternoon, after finishing the chores, I sat on the porch steps and watched a storm gather in the distance. The sky darkened in layers, clouds stacking like unspoken thoughts. I remember feeling, suddenly and without warning, an overwhelming sense of calm. No one was watching me. No one was waiting for me to perform, to please, to submit. My life was small, yes, but it was also mine. Limited, yes, but honest. In that moment, I understood that freedom was not the absence of constraint. It was the presence of self. I had carried that knowledge with me ever since, like a smooth stone in my pocket. It grounded me. It reminded me who I was when the world tried to rename me. I decided to write that story last, not for publication, not for applause, for completion. Each morning I sat at my desk and wrote slowly, letting memory rise without interrogation. I wrote about the porch steps, about the storm, about the exact moment my fear loosened its grip. When I finished, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. Samuel noticed the change before I named it. "You seem lighter," he said one evening as we washed dishes together. "I am," I answered and smiled. Time, ever patient, continued its work. Friends passed, new ones arrived, my body asked for more rest, more kindness. I gave it willingly. I stopped measuring days by productivity and started measuring them by presence. Did I listen well? Did I speak honestly? Did I leave space for wonder? Some days the answers were no. Most days they were enough. The last letter I received from a stranger came on a spring morning, the envelope thin, the message brief. A woman wrote to tell me she had left a marriage that was shrinking her. She said my words had helped her understand that staying silent was not the same as staying safe. She thanked me for naming a life she hadn't known was possible. I wrote back, carefully, with the respect her courage deserved. I didn't tell her what to do next. I told her to listen to herself. That had always been the point. Now, when people ask me what my story is about, I pause. It would be easy to say it's about hardship, or love, or survival. Those are all true, but incomplete. It's about learning that your voice matters even when it trembles. It's about discovering that respect can be as intimate as passion. It's about understanding that the life you build quietly can echo farther than the one you shout about. I sit by the window again, the light different now, softer. Lily is older. Soon she will ask different questions. When she does, I will answer her honestly without burdening her with my fear or shielding her from truth. I will trust her strength the way I once learned to trust my own. I am more than a grandmother, I am a witness. And my story, finally told, rests easily inside me. The ending did not arrive as an ending. It arrived as a morning. I woke before the sun, the way I often do now, my body attuned to light more than clocks. The house was quiet, not empty quiet, but held quiet. Samuel slept beside me, his breathing uneven but familiar, the sound of a life that had learned how to rest without guarding itself. I lay there for a long time, listening, feeling the steady ache in my knees, the slow gratitude in my chest. At some point, I realized there was nothing left I was avoiding. That recognition felt almost startling. So much of my life had been shaped by moving towards something safety, understanding, voice, or away from something fear, silence, erasure. But that morning there was nowhere else to go, no chapter waiting to be unlocked, no truth crouched in the corner asking for courage, only presence. I rose carefully and padded into the kitchen. Outside, the sky was pale blue, undecided. I put water on for tea and stood at the window, my reflection faint in the glass. An old woman, yes, but not diminished. I had learned that age does not hollow you out, it clarifies you. The kettle whistled. Steam curled upward. I poured the water and carried my mug to the small desk by the window, the same desk where I had written so many versions of myself into being. The notebooks were stacked neatly now, finished, closed. I ran my fingers over their spines and felt no urgency to open them again. Some stories are meant to be lived forward, not revisited. Later that morning, the family gathered as they often did on Sundays. Children and grandchildren spilled into the house, bringing noise and warmth and the particular chaos that signals continuity. I watched from my chair as coats were dropped, shoes abandoned, laughter ricocheted off walls. Lily, no longer small, no longer 7, sat beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder without asking. I wrapped an arm around her automatically. Grandma, she said, her voice older now, edged with the first hints of independence, do you think people can be happy and sad at the same time? Yes, I said without hesitation. I think that's how most real lives are. She considered that, then smiled. That makes sense. At lunch, my daughter asked if I'd consider recording my stories, my voice preserved for later years, for later ears. The suggestion landed gently. I didn't recoil from it the way I once might have. Maybe, I said. And meant maybe, not no. After everyone left, the house settled again. Samuel and I sat together in the late afternoon light, not talking much. There was no need. Silence between us had long ago stopped being a problem to solve. It was simply another shared space. You've been thinking, he said eventually. I've been finishing, I replied. He smiled, his hand finding mine. That sounds like you. As evening came on, I stepped outside alone. The air was cool, the sky brushed with pink and gray. I walked slowly around the yard, my steps measured, intentional. I stopped at the edge of the property and looked out, not at fields anymore, but at houses, trees, lights beginning to glow. I thought of Walter then, not with sadness, but with acknowledgement. He had been part of my becoming, even if the world never knew how to name that. I hoped, wherever memory goes when it leaves the body, that he knew his honesty had given me room to breathe. I thought of my father, of the man he had been and the limits he had lived inside. I thought of my mother, her journal, her quiet wish that my life would feel like my own. I thought of the women whose letters had crossed my path, whose courage had intersected with mine for a moment, leaving both of us changed. I thought of the girl I had been, nodding because she didn't yet know she could speak. If I could tell her one final thing, it would be this: survival is not the highest form of living, but it can be the doorway to it. I went back inside as night settled fully, locking the door out of habit, not fear. Samuel was already preparing for bed. I joined him, easing myself under the covers, the familiar weight grounding me. As the light clicked off, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but complete. I had loved in ways that surprised me. I had endured without disappearing. I had spoken when silence would have been easier. I had stayed soft in a world that often rewards hardness. That, I understood now, was enough. Sleep came easily. And if this is the place where my story rests, then let it rest here, not as a lesson carved in stone, but as a living truth passed hand to hand, voice to voice. I was not extraordinary, I was present. And that presence became a life. The end is not silence, it is peace.